Jordan, I feel like you would probably not enjoy the experience of a strip club by that logic.
You know, Sam.
You know what?
You know what? You're wrong on that one. I have found a very unique way to enjoy the strip club. I've had some good times there. So I can't hate. You know?
Welcome to the Technically Diverse Podcast, featuring the Quadcast crew.
Okay, it's that time. Welcome to episode number 11 of the Technically Diverse Podcast. I'm your host, Jordan. Co-hosting the pod is our resident adrenaline junkie, Ruby.
Hi, everyone. Live from Goa.
Behind the scenes, working magic is Uncle Mike. Remember, if it ain't Mike, it ain't right.
Hey, how's it going today?
And keeping us in line and doling out our law and order is our producer, Peaches, aka Roz.
Hi.
Okay, so today we are joined by another special guest, Miss Samantha Sun. She is an artist, a dancer, a stripper, a circus performer, and she holds a BA in fine art, and she's currently pursuing her master's in social innovation and entrepreneurship. Thank you for being on the show, Sam.
Thanks for having me.
So, Sam, I've said before, I've told the Quadcast crew here how I've wanted to have you on the show. We met a while back while recreational boxing. Sam instantly stood out to me as someone who was a little different because she showed up to a boxing class with full makeup on and wearing a leotard. And,
Did I?
and I'll never forget because you were wearing makeup and a leotard. So Sam came waltzing into our gym. And I was like, who is this? Who's this lady?
Oh my god, I had no idea that's how you thought of me. I literally just post my ass on Instagram. I had no idea that this was having such an effect. Actually.
You see how life can have unintended consequences? You post a picture of your ass and then somebody gets enlightened somehow through the other content that you have there as well. And I'd have to say, generally, you're such a good Instagram follow. Like before I follow anybody on Instagram, I make sure to look at their profile to make sure that they're posting enough, that there's content that's cool, and you definitely, like Roz, delivered on that. So happy to, well, Roz, I saw your eyebrows go up there.
Roz, are you posting your ass too? Am I missing out on something?
I'm just gonna clarify this right now. My Instagram is a little bit different.
Okay.
But for some reason, Jordan has been on my ass nonstop.
Whoa. Easy with that.
I would love to edit what I just said out, Mike, and then redo that.
That's too good to edit out.
That Jordan is constantly bothering me about my very modest poses.
Yes, modest.
Okay. I'm gonna stalk you later. And see
Okay, you can totally check it out. You're gonna be so disappointed. There's nothing interesting.
No ass. Okay.
So, Sam,
Yes.
you know, some people might consider you to be scary. You know,
I am aware.
You're this well-educated, talented young woman who's breaking down barriers and, really pushing back against accepted norms. You're doing this while giving back and kind of drawing awareness to like overlooked causes, right? From my, growing up and from what I've observed with pop culture, it's made it pretty clear to me that, and I'm kind of paraphrasing this. This is just, a stereotype that I've seen that, sex workers are generally regarded as dumb, lazy, faceless whores who are addicted to drugs, have daddy issues, and are generally seedy reprobates. I find that broad stereotype doesn't align with you. So, could it be that sex workers are just ordinary professionals who are making a living providing services to a market with an unquenchable thirst?
I mean, yes, but then also I'm not like denying that we're a bunch of seedy, disgusting reprobates. Like we definitely are. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I also I would like to challenge the idea that somehow having drug addiction and daddy issues isn't already inherently a part of, women's kind of lives in general. And it's not because we do sex work, it's because men mistreat us. So like that's not that's like lawyers have those issues too, right? But you never
That's
go, oh, how dare this lawyer have a coke habit? You just let them have their lives because you respect what they do. It just comes down to people thinking sex work is somehow a like marker of your morality, and it allows people to pass judgment on you for no real rational reason. But yeah, that's kind of what it is. It's not like it's just not a monolith. I just don't think you can like look at people who do sex work and think like, oh, they must be this way or that way, because like you all, whether you know it or not, you have all met and know very well somebody who does sex work. And if you think you don't, it's because they don't feel comfortable enough telling you.
I can't deny it.
Yeah, I can't deny that either. Like that, I would be saying a bold-faced lie if I said that I didn't know any other people that did sex work. That'd be a lie. So I'm not about to do that. I'm not a liar. Mike's not a liar. Well, I mean, it's okay. So Sam, why do you think people are so like generally uptight about sex work and like talking about it? Like, I know it's kind of a broad question to put on there, but what have you seen?
I mean, it's a mix between the fact that we live in like obviously like a patriarchal society, and so the second anybody sees women going, hey, I get objectified, what if I just profit off of it? Suddenly everybody's like, oh no, you can't do that. That's not okay. You were supposed to stand down and just take it. And then there's like the fact that we also live in like we like to think we live in secular society, but so much of our policy and our legislation is informed by just Christian puritanical values. And so because we organize society like that and we've been taught to moralize like that, the idea that you would sin, so just be a sodomite for money, like is unthinkable to some people. And then it's like the value that the weird kind of moralizing again that we assign to sex, which is very, again, irrational. But the idea that you could debase something that we as a society seem to hold at like a sacred value as just a service or a product is, again, really unthinkable to some people. But like if you just use like some basic critical thought, you can like navigate that kind of thing and just break out of that weird like thought process and be like, oh, okay, well, this is something that just people something do, and like it's not a marker of your morality or your how ethical you are, and it's fine, and we should just let people sell pussy for money and post their pictures of their assholes on Instagram. Like we should just let them do
that. So we're free after all, so anything should go. I've heard that stripping is about female empowerment. I hear that a lot, like that narrative. It's about empowerment, women taking control of their bodies. What are your thoughts on that?
It's about money. Again, I mean, I resent the idea that people have this sort of, again, a certain group of people like to misconstrue sex work as if it was about empowerment, but in like an embodied way. And so they think that empowerment comes from like overcoming your trauma about your body or like feeling sexy after you've been called fat your whole life. Like that is not what empowerment is about. I literally do not care about that kind of empowerment. Empowerment is about having access to justice and your rights and money. Nobody goes into sex work for trying to like, I'm trying to like be empowered. That's not why people do it. They do it for money. So, I mean, that is like a broader question about how we frame certain things, especially about marginalized communities, as being this gentrified white middle class Pilates version of what it actually is. Yeah, that's my long answer.
Wow. Roz, did I see that you had your hand up? Did you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I wanted to say that I think that what you're saying is very, very accurate. The people that I do know that are like strippers or involved in sex work, it really is the main goal of it is to have upward mobility that you may not have had otherwise. A lot of the times people don't have access to getting those jobs that are high paying jobs. Sometimes they're working minimum wage. And that's obviously not enough for anything. If any, in basically any country, I don't know why we haven't raised it. That's a whole nother topic. But on top of that, this is a way that women have found they've been able to make money, and a lot of it.
Yeah.
Uncle Mike.
Yeah, so I was listening to what you were saying, and what I was thinking, it brought up questions in my head. Do you think part of how we think about it today is what came from the past? So over time, it to me it seems to be a little bit more accepted today than it was in the past. And then so people who still have that thought of, oh, this is not an accepted career or job, it's more on how it was from the past and not now. You know what I'm saying?
I guess yes and no, because and when I do a lot of my activism, sometimes I get quite like pessimistic about things, and it's hard not to when you are dealing with issues with marginalized communities. And so sometimes I feel like the only answer is that the old heads just need to fucking die, and then we will be fine, right? Like that's sometimes how I feel about it, right? Because like it doesn't feel like I can change the minds of people who are like fucking 50. I'm just like, y'all just need to die, right? Sorry.
No, Mike, no, come on, Uncle Mike. No, come on, man. You're not
Mike is on your side.
But I don't actually think necessarily that age matters, because there's plenty of people who are my age who are ignorant as fuck, who have like a vested interest in upholding certain systems of oppression. And so, and like it's not just like, oh, their vested interest is like, oh, I feel better about myself. No, it's like their paycheck depends on them upholding and believing certain things. So I think like everything else, there's like a whole history behind why we have certain misconceptions about certain kinds of people or the industry in general, and that we don't sort of look at that history sort of critically is part of the reason why it just keeps like perpetuating, and why we haven't enacted anything to do with harm reduction meaningfully globally about sex work. And it is like a historical thing. I don't think people really like. I'm trying to think of like a good example of. Okay, so like people don't really look at 1970s or 80s feminism that critically, right? Like they sort of see that sort of time within American porn, for example, as a catalyst for what ended up being criminalization, the complete criminalization of prostitution in the US. What they don't see, right, is that those feminists who had a vested interest in an anti-pornography law were basically losing that war in the 70s and 80s. And then in the 90s started a coalition with evangelical Republicans and like fucking like white nationalists and conservatives. And I'm like, if you have to team up with those people, maybe your fight ain't right.
Kind of sounds like Donald Trump to me.
Well, yeah, and so these sort of radical feminists who were like anti-sex work basically were like, we don't have a platform to stand on. So they had a coalition with them lot, and managed to, under the guise of stopping trafficking, managed to criminalize prostitution altogether. And that's like, that is the history, and that's like sort of where sort of currently we stand with American prostitution laws and how we see sex work. But all of that sort of ulterior motive stuff we don't really talk about. Like, you don't talk about how like, oh, actually these feminists don't have anybody's best interest at heart. They are here for their own political like sort of needs and wants. They have ulterior motives, and they were willing to team up with like evil people to do it.
So Sam, I know you've done some research, and before we kind of jump in there, I want to just back up for our audience, because I feel that it's important that we kind of you help us define what a sex worker is, because even when Uncle Mike and I were talking, like we were trying to figure out like what that encapsulates. Could you help us kind of define that?
So sex work is kind of like a very broad umbrella term for anybody who is using their erotic capital for financial gain. And it kind of depends on the person. Like, not everybody likes the label sex work. A lot of strippers don't think they're sex workers because they don't actually touch, for example. They just dance.
Mm-hmm.
I would argue otherwise. I think strippers are sex workers because of lots of listen, if you're paying me for a lap dance and you want to touch my butt and you're paying me to touch my what else would you call that?
Right. Yeah.
But it's up to the person, and I believe in like people's sort of individual autonomy to decide how they want to be seen. So I never like impose that label on anybody. You have people, for example, like sugar babies might not consider themselves sex workers because they're in relationships. But I'm like, well, you're a glorified escort. Like, you wouldn't be sleeping with this like 50-something-year-old like pedophile. No, it's okay. It's all right. You just happen to be in the age group.
It's okay. Uncle Mike's a little sensitive today. We're just getting past daylight savings time. He's a little sensitive.
It's okay. But yeah, like, they might not consider themselves to be sex workers, but I'm like, what else would you call what you do? You sleep with this man for money. You might either be getting an allowance, or you might actually be trying to get into his will. I don't know. What else would you call that? But they might not consider themselves sex workers. People have in their brains like, oh, like tricks on the street, like that's what sex work is. And I'm like, it's a lot of things. Like,
I'm glad you brought that up, because Mike and I that's the kind of direction we were going in, and then we were like, wait a second, it seems a little broader than that. That can't be right.
It's a lot broader, and it really depends on the person you ask. I would say maybe instead of assuming somebody is a sex worker, probably just asking them like, do you identify as one, is the nicest way to approach that.
So Sam, you also brought up strippers. I know you've done work with the East London Strippers Collective and Life Drawing. One of the things that we've kind of highlighted throughout the pandemic is the way technology has kind of enabled different businesses to thrive online. And, even us, like, we've been able to launch and do this podcast without getting together really. So can you talk about how technology has kind of, enabled sex work to continue maybe in a safe and positive manner during the pandemic?
So, I mean, sex workers kind of, in my opinion, pioneered the internet as far as we know it. They've just been kicked off platforms as they become popularized. So if you think about sites like Patreon, even Instagram, Snapchat, Snapchat was like made for strippers and sex workers. But the internet, sort of broadly speaking, even before the pandemic, allowed for people to advocate on their own and make money on their own without the intervention of people like agencies or pimps. Because if you can just put a Craigslist ad up for yourself, what the fuck do you need an agency for? You just do that for yourself, and you are able to, like, not have to give away 30 to 50% of your income to somebody else.
30 to 50%?
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a steep cut.
That is on average. Throughout the pandemic, I don't know if you sort of know about this one site called OnlyFans, but that got really popular.
OnlyFans?
Yeah.
I don't think I've heard of that one. Ross, have you heard of OnlyFans?
Yeah.
Who are you kidding? Jordan has an OnlyFans account.
I mean, it's okay. It's very, very oversaturated right now, and currently I would argue that maybe getting into it now is the best thing you could get out of it is maybe some pocket money. It's a full-time job, but it's basically allowing people to have a subscription service to their homemade porn, right? They take 20%. That's a lot.
What you're saying, to do what? It sounds a lot like the record industry. So you have those artists that are out there right now, and they're making their own music, and then they're doing the distribution themselves. Actually,
exactly.
through the same means.
Exactly. And I'm not saying all agencies or are bad, for example. Like, I actually think the idea of an agency, if they could be held to like an ethical standard and held accountable for their fucking fascist behavior, would be great. Because the thing with lots of artists and sex workers is it's like herding cats. These people are not used to collaborating because they're very sort of like free spirits and they work on their own. So managing them is really difficult. It's part of what makes activism around sex work really difficult, because they're not a monolith, because they all work very differently and they're very used to working in their own way. Organizing amongst them is tough. They also have a lot of like marginalization. So people have kids, people are suffering like racial abuse on a regular fucking basis. Like you can't ask people like that to take on so much, because they don't have that. Whereas white feminists who hate us are great at organizing and creating websites and creating like legal documents on why we shouldn't exist. So so the idea of an agency would be great if they weren't exploitative, but they mostly are. And I'm not saying all sex workers also don't want to pay like a commission. Like I would happily give away 20% if my agency actually was giving me quality work.
You want a value add.
Yeah, quality work. They were, doing my marketing really, really well, but they don't. So fuck them.
Ross.
I wanted to add, I think that the only place in the US that has legal sex work is Nevada. And in those places, like in Nevada, it's only legal to be a sex worker in a few different, I can't remember what they're called, but they're not called brothels, but
like in that context.
Yeah, but basically what it is, it's like a building that has those licenses that were grandfathered in from when it was legal prior to the 70s or whenever it was that it went illegal. And I've heard that in those places you have to pay about 50% of your income to owners in order for you to keep your like room or whatever it is there.
So here is I guess like the point of contention that people like the layman would not understand. Like people think I want to legalize sex work. I'm like, no. I want to decriminalize it. I don't want anybody, law enforcement, licensing councils, I don't want any of them involved in how I can make my money and what I should have to be able to pay them in order to make my money. I just do not want to be over policed. I don't want law enforcement involved at all. The only kind of involvement I want from government agencies or charities otherwise is if they are, enacting in harm reduction. So I don't like treating this as if it's a criminal issue will never fix anything. Because I mean, we all know this and we've been knowing this. It has to be treated as a public health issue. And so what actually helps people sort of move away from sex work and become safer or do it in a way that gets them, not fucking killed is having access to healthcare services, constant STD and STI checks, having like access to like kind of not really law enforcement, but like welfare checks that don't actually get the police involved, for example.
Yeah.
Like that is kind of what we need. And if something is criminalized, you can't have those services. But then when something is legalized, what ends up happening is that thing in Nevada, or for example, in Ontario, you can't be a stripper in a club without a license. You have to pay fucking Ontario $300 a year just to do this. And I'm like, what does this license get me? Nothing.
Just access, and then you still get 50% of your wages taken.
And so it's like, so I've paid you and every other stripper has given you $300 to $400 per year for this license. What do we get out of it? What are the protections? You give us zero. There is no recourse to workers' rights. There's no sort of like union or tribunal you can go to like complain about clubs. There's nothing.
Wow.
Is that license you get, is there any sort of criteria that you have to get to qualify for it? Or you just go in and say, here, give me a license and you pay your money?
It's, in my opinion, it's another sort of roundabout way for government agencies to have access to your ID.
Of course.
Yes, to your
identify you.
So what that means, right? So it means that people who aren't 19 can't do this. That's a separate, I think this is a separate question of like underage people and whether or not underage people are capable of being, consenting to sex work. But I mean, we can have that conversation, that debate all we want, but the reality is there are people who are 14 to 16 doing this for survival reasons. And so what happens when you have this legalized system of trying to bureaucratize this work is you've cut them out. You've cut those people out of an industry that requires them that would have like more distance from the explicit content because they're stripping and not just doing sex work, like full service. Now you've cut them out of that pie. You've also completely cut out people who are undocumented migrants. who, for whatever reason, cannot engage in civilian vanilla work because of their migrant status, because of maybe their hold on the English language, and now you've cut them out of stripping. So what are they going to do? They go into more dangerous versions of sex work because everyone has to eat and survive. Wow. So that's what that license does, right? It's to me, it's like gatekeeping, really, is what it is. It's telling people that you have to have a certain level of capital already just to engage in this industry, which is bullshit.
So how has your work with the East London Strippers Club kind of turned that on its head? Because I've seen that you've gone online now, and things have kind of are seemingly changing. Can you jump into that a little bit?
So I am the world's brokest director of a company. I'm on the board of directors. We incorporated in June. We've been doing stuff for 6 years, but again, I told you, organizing a bunch of strippers, organizing cats, impossible. So we finally incorporated.
Nice.
What we do, and other directors and other members of our collective might give you a different answer, but how I see what we do is repackaging our erotic capital in a way that allows us to work sort of above the surface of legality. So instead of trying to have a resource for strippers to just keep stripping, we try to organize and create events and spaces that allow us to still engage in the aesthetic and the the work of sex work without having to come into contact with things like licensing issues, like bylaws, so one of the things we do that has been really, really successful is a life drawing class where we only hire strippers, and we get them in pre-COVID, we get them to come pole dance for us, and people just draw these incredible athletic strippers on a pole. We have some poses that might involve lap dancing poses. We sort of tell our stories. I think it allows people to sort of meet us as people, breaks down stigma, and it puts money into all of our pockets. So, and what I feel like that does is a form of harm reduction, where it's okay, this Monday night where you could be in a strip club losing money because you still have to pay money to a club. Every night we work, we pay anywhere between 50 to 80 pounds to the club to work. I have walked out of work before making negative money.
Oh, wow.
What job are you doing that you think about on the other side of things? What job are you doing where you lose, you're negative after? That's insane.
The only other people I know who work like this is personal trainers, for example, because they have to pay the gym, right?
Right. Ruby, I see you want to jump into.
Yeah. Personal trainers aren't criminalized, so.
Yeah, I just had a question. So, you want to get into any business or work to make a livelihood. So how long is somebody running negative? And what's to say that you're making a choice to be hey, I keep going in the negative? What are the alternatives? What are the options? How often do you have to be negative to be I can't do this?
It really depends. I would be lying if I said there are girls who never go negative. We all do, but I think it's a real testament to how shitty civilian jobs are and how shitty they pay, that despite all of this mistreatment, stripping is still sometimes better than a civilian job. I miss it. I would still go back. Despite all of this, I would still mitigate that over fucking writing a resume and trying to convince somebody else to having to answer to somebody else and getting paid in not cash so that I have to pay taxes on that shit. I would still prefer stripping to that. And that's not a testament to sex work. That's a testament to how fucking bad civilian work is. So it's rough, and it depends on the place where you work. So not Australia and New Zealand, great for stripping. Fucking great. The clubs are pretty great. I've never really heard girls complain too much. There's obviously mistreatment and mismanagement all the time. It's not too bad. In London and in Toronto, one of the reasons it's so bad is because they are both subject to the same, strangely enough, the same license/bylaw that basically says to get a sexual entertainment venue license is insanely difficult, and they've made it so that you basically can't do it anymore, which means that there's like this never-ending amount of shutting down of venues, but no new venues popping up. So then the people who own the clubs have a monopoly, and they have no vested interest to better their treatment of girls, because there's the pool of girls just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. The people who are desperate enough to work for like that amount of money and give you that kind of house fee is getting bigger and bigger too. So the people like me who would be like, hey, fuck you, you can't treat me like this, they'll just fire us and not hire us back, because there's no incentive to treat us better.
Yeah, there's no accountability, and it sounds like a government created monopoly almost, because
Exactly.
there's no new competition popping up to encourage you to change. So why would you have to change? You can just do status quo.
Exactly. And the license is different from a regular alcohol license, because a regular bar only has to renew their license. This is in London. I'm not really sure in Toronto or Ontario how this works, because I don't fucking live here anymore. You have to renew your bar/nightclub license maybe once every 3, 5, sometimes 10 years, depending on the kind of license you have and your seniority, right? Strip club licenses, you must renew every single year. They cost hundreds of thousands of pounds. How is a venue supposed to pay this if they are not scraping off our wages?
Yeah.
It comes from the top down. If this license was not super fucking expensive, then maybe the clubs would not take so much money from us. And if they didn't take so much money from us, the girls would be less desperate, and they would treat clients better instead of trying to get them drunk and rinsing them, or trying to, trap and usually sell cocaine 4K in the club. And the like whole health of the industry would just be better. But because it's so expensive, you get this knock-on effect of mismanagement and abuse, and it's just bad and unhealthy for the industry.
I wonder if the people that created the framework for the licensing were, maybe influenced by some, religious views or some sort to kind of, get rid of strip clubs. Like,
yeah,
there seems to be a weird kind of parallel there. I wonder if that's a thing.
I don't know that it's religious groups, but in London, in the UK mostly, it's a particularly loud group of radical feminists who think that the existence of sex work is contributing to sexual harassment. Now, that's a Venn diagram with a lot of overlap. And I think the problem is that these people cannot see us as both victims and also consenting adults. You can be a victim of sexual abuse and also consenting to sex work. Like, I'm an adult. We do both. Every single sex worker is a victim of abuse, right? But like, our engagement in sex work doesn't actually like affect the amount of harassment we get. Like, those things are like two separate issues, and trying to get rid of our ability to make a living is making our ability to escape harassment actually much harder. And it's these people that for some reason it's in their vested interest to blur the lines between the two and misconstrue us as victims or completely erase us out of the victim narrative that causes this. And so the reason why licensing is really this bad right now in London is because in 2009 this feminist group was able to lobby all the councils to say, you need to redo the Policing and Crime Act and put in this basically nil policy for licensing, because the existence of strip clubs is dirtying our streets and making people sinful and horrible, and you have to get rid of them because they're bad for women. And not a single stripper obviously was talked to during this process. None of us were consulted about whether or not we thought the clubs were actually contributing to our so-called victimhood.
Oh man, that's mind-numbingly frustrating. Sam, let's deep dive into your research, because your research is incredible. It certainly, again, has per your reputation, taught me something, and was thought-provoking. So again, you delivered. So please tell us about your research and
So the past 3 months of me just sitting at home in my fucking house, like in my parents' house, in my room, taking pictures of my rectum to put on the internet, has taught me a lot about the internet. So isn't that funny? I love saying it like that, because like that's exactly.
I know that's what I was laughing at. It's just the way you said it. I was like,
I love it.
Yeah.
People on the internet are so funny. They just want to see what I had for breakfast, and I'm like, okay.
Literally looking for it. Like,
Oh my God, Sam, you are killing me right now.
All right, so like that's what I've been doing, right? And then obviously when you do things like that, you run into issues of shadow banning and censorship on platforms like Instagram, like Facebook. So I started, right, so I'll tell you the story of how it started because this is how it makes sense in my brain. I was approached by a Italian pole dancer. She's not a stripper. She's just a fucking civilian pole dancer. Bless her. She's very nice, but like, I'm just like, you don't sell pussy. You're not the same. We don't like you. So she started. It's rude. I know. She knows how I feel. It's fine. I know it's rude, but whatever. She basically started a petition because Instagram, December 20th, 2020, changed their terms of services. And it's basically, it doesn't change their views on what constitutes as nudity. So women still can't show their nipples, but men can. Very strange. What about the trans women, the trans men? Do they count? We don't know. Very vague. Okay. And you can't obviously like shove a dildo up whatever hole you have and post it on Instagram. That's considered explicit. So that has always been like that. That stays. But then what is changed is what is their consideration of solicitation. So if, like, I cannot message Jordan a saucy picture of me and go, hey, do you want to meet up later? It might not even be like that. It might not even be like, it may just be like, hey, Sam, can you just send me a picture and then we meet up later for a coffee? That is considered solicitation now because there has been some kind of saucy picture and this wording that allows you to meet up outside the app. That is what they considered solicitation now. There's been no exchange of money. There's no contextual anything there. It just destroys people's ability not only to engage in safer sex work, but also like flirt and hook up. Like that is what they consider solicitation now.
Isn't that something that happens all the time?
What? Yeah, that sounds so normal.
No, but they consider that solicitation now. So it makes the definition so much stricter because they've broadened it using their language. And that creates more and more account bans, shutdown of accounts. People aren't allowed to get their accounts back. They're not really given a reason. So this blogger on Pole, my pole dancer friend, started a petition, and she asked me if I wanted to be on it. So before they launch a petition on change.org, you have a certain amount of people who co-sign on it. So I did that. Then after that launched, I got put into a group full of really angry strippers from LA. Bless their hearts. Very angry. Gotta love them. And we started sort of doing some organizing and trying to like talk about certain new legislation that it's been killed in Congress, but it's going to happen again. So we're trying to pay attention. And one of them went, hey, does anybody want to do some research on Section 230 and FOSTA SESTA, the Earn It Act, CICIA, to sort of to share with us and try to get us some understanding of like the legislation and policy around cyber law. And so I was like, I'm the world's busiest unemployed person, but I don't have kids. I don't have shit to do. I don't even make myself dinner. My mom sorts that out. So I have time. I fucking have time. So, and I'm a nerd at the end of the day because I hate to use Asian stereotypes, but I was raised like that. So like, I love being academic. I love sitting down and just being a nerd and reading like academic journals. That to me is very exciting. I could do that. So I was like, okay, fine, I'll do it. So I go down this rabbit hole because it's not just internet legislation on what counts as like obscene content or objectionable content. It's not just that. It's basically I'm looking at the past, present, and future of the internet as we know it, and a lot of the policies currently that they're pushing forward that are encroaching on things like encryption, on privacy, on like data mining and all that stuff is done under the guise of saving the children. So trying to get rid of child sex abuse material on the internet. We're not going to call it child pornography. I'll get into that in a second, but child sex abuse material, CSAM, and then trafficking. This is their two pillars that they stand on. They think censoring the internet will somehow get rid of these two things, and they don't. Surprise, surprise.
What do you mean? There's just no magic silver bullet that could just solve it all?
I know.
I mean, we can just legislate anything. It'll solve everything.
Shocking. And so basically what happened is I just wanted to take pictures of my butthole and post it on the internet, and now I'm doing the work of the FBI. I didn't sign up for this. And so that's kind of taken me for 3 months. I've been doing tons and tons and tons of research and reading and like attending lectures, and it's continuous because the changes and innovations that we see in technology and in cyber law are ever changing. And it's been really, really interesting. And I've been trying to, I suppose, make this part of my advocacy as well, because I think it's interesting to me that regular civilians use the internet and they have no idea what the legal ramifications are of what they do.
I'm surprised you were able to read through the terms of service, because that thing is like a Bible. Like they're thick, and for you to be able to go through that and pull out stuff is a testament.
It's hilarious. Like you can't technically, using the eggplant emoji and the peach emoji now counts as soliciting.
Really?
Isn't that funny?
Wow.
Yeah.
A lot of people learn in a lot of trouble.
Kids.
Yeah, people are getting in trouble 100%. I mean, this also asks questions of like, should people who are under the age of 18 be allowed on these apps? Probably not, but they're gonna be. And the reason why platforms don't kick them off is because they are easily monetized.
But isn't this just some way to, like, for Instagram to separate itself from like a dating app like Tinder or something like that? Like,
no, it's basically them covering their asses, because I don't think this is like Facebook policy's fault. Do I think that they have some accountability here? Obviously, but they have these really strict terms of service because they are afraid of their legal liability. What Section 230 says, which is kind of responsible for the internet as we know it. I mean, it's not like Canadian law, but it's American law, and we all use American sites, so we have no choice but to abide by these policies. Section 230 basically says that internet service providers, platforms, and websites are not liable for the content their third-party users post. It also gives them legal protection from whatever the consequences of their moderation are. It lets them basically set their own rules for content moderation, right? So that has basically protected like sites like YouTube and Facebook, because otherwise they'd be drowning in lawsuits constantly, right? And so it's like a double-edged sword. Like, this law has allowed things like revenge porn sites and snuff film sites to exist, and like fucking actual Nazi sites, but then it also protects like our freedom of speech, because this is allows innovation to happen, and like these really important conversations that about sensitive topics that otherwise you would probably get sued for defamation for. Where was I going with this? Anyway, that is like response for the internet as we know it, and it's relevant to sex workers because Facebook and Instagram are now worried about now what constitutes as like what they can be held legally liable for, because of all these extra policies that are kind of like carve outs that are trying to poke holes in Section 230. And so they're worried about their legal liability, which is why they change their terms of services to kick off more and more and more ability for having sort of sexually perverse content.
So how are they going about enforcing these things? Because I know that, you know, they use algorithms and stuff to serve up the content. Are they fiddling around with the algorithms in the back end to tamper this stuff down?
Yeah. So, I mean, how some of their bots and how their moderation works, obviously, it comes down to two things: who's reporting it, and if something just gets reported, they take it down immediately, because like, and you'd have to basically appeal and have an actual human look at it before you could get something reposted. That's one thing. But the other thing is they just have these algorithms, not actual people, looking at their content and trying to flag out what for them looks like solicitation. So that might be, you know, a bare butt. That also might look like anybody who says link in bio, who's trying to like link to an other site or link outside of that, or any words like sex is censored, fucking like stripper is censored. For a while there, the hashtag woman was censored, but you could still click on the hashtag. Yeah.
What?
Yeah, and then like separately, what I think is also like an important thing, like a compounding issues of marginalization happening for all of BLM during 2020. the Black Lives Matter hashtag was censored. Like you could get shadow banned for that or taken down because
What?
Instagram's algorithm was picking that up as what their reasoning for this is that because so many people started using that hashtag, it flagged up their spam censors. I don't think that's the case. I don't think that's the case at all. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but this is one of those things where I'm like, okay, the issue is actually a lot worse than we think it is. So all these compounding factors of now people who are sex workers, who are also people of color, who are Black, who are trans, who are queer, they're getting all their hashtags censored or taken off. You're much more likely to be taken off banned from Instagram for posting about like hashtag LGBTQ than you are for anything else, really. There's like statistics on this where like the most banned like hashtag or the people who experience the most amount of censorship are people in the gay community. And yeah, so this, I mean, it's a bigger question of like algorithmic bias and who gets to decide like who gets to monetize on their sites. Like I don't actually think a singular person or a singular algorithm should be able to decide that for us. It's a problem. It's like a big problem, and this is like an ongoing part of my research. We'll see what happens.
We'll go to Roz and then Ruby.
Do you see similar bans for other groups, like I don't know, white nationalist groups or anything else like that?
So the reason anybody knows about, like any civilian would know about shadow banning is because white national groups and like just people who support Trump and hate groups and far right get banned for this stuff, for like hate speech, because hello, of course, they're literally organizing to terrorize. They organized the Capitol riots through social media. Like that was allowed to happen because of that. And they're screaming, oh, you like, you know, their First Amendment rights, you can't shadow ban us, freedom of speech. And I'm like, this is sort of like the hard part. It's like, where do you draw the line between what you're doing, which is putting actual lives in danger, but then the second somebody goes, oh, hey, maybe we should attend this protest, it's for trans pride, blah 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 blah, make sure you're safe, make sure you're this, hashtag trans pride, why does that person get immediately flagged and taken down? And that's also a bigger question of like policing, over policing of certain communities, of why do we see one group as and give them the benefit of the doubt for whether or not they are not safe versus another group, especially when you look at context for those things. Yeah, they also have like, they have skin in the game, they 100% do as well, but I think I think they're engaging in far more harmful behavior than me wanting to sell pictures of my butthole on the internet, you know.
So Ruby, I saw that you had your hand up. Did you want to jump in with a question?
Yeah, the interesting thing about shadow banning is, you know, it's happening from a North American perspective and what censorship is, but could you also just imagine the more conservative countries, like a lot of Asian countries, specifically, I would speak of India, where I don't even think any of those words would be even, like, I think immediately they'd be like banned. So just interesting from that perspective as well on a global scale, where you would take censorship and thoughts around any kind of sexual, anything to do related with the sex industry, or even saying the word sex. Like it's just insane.
I mean, I think a lot about this in terms of the Hong Kong protests, right? And how the protesters there were organizing, and how, for like, this happened before BLM, and then after, a lot of American protesters and in the Western world were taking cues from how brilliantly I think the Hong Kong protesters were dealing with this. And for them, censorship has even more at stake, because the Chinese government is watching you. The CCP are fucking terrifying. And like, I mean, there's obviously concentric circles here, and like it's a Venn diagram with like a lot of overlap. But I think if society sort of listened to, I think, the canary in the coal mines, which have always been sex workers, particularly the most marginalized of them, so queer sex workers of color, then we might not be in a position where regular normal people have to delete their Facebook, have to delete their like entire sort of digital footprint, and when they go to protest, only communicate via Signal or Telegram or Bluetooth messages, or even at one point somebody was like, we have to message through Pokemon Go because we can't trust encrypted messages.
Talk about the last refuge, Pokemon Go. Wow.
I know. Or the fact that I'm actually pretty sure that like the current protests in India for like the farmers, like those hashtags are being watched. Or again, with like a lot of this is like, it's not data mining. It's like when third-party services scrape websites for like just like mass amounts of data for people's identification. And so this is how they arrested tons of BLM protesters, because they were basically like, okay, who's using the hashtag?
Yeah.
Let's just use that to start watching them and surveil them, and then make your arrests. Like that's a terrible way to organize law enforcement. That's just But they're utilizing these tools to like their advantage. And I think that social media platforms and big tech have a lot to answer for. Like, you are the ones who have cultivated this data, you've made it public, and you've allowed it to become a political tool against people. So I'd actually think it'd be really interesting to hear like what you guys think from a tech perspective, a lot of the algorithmic bias stuff, because I think about it in like a socioeconomic way, like how does this impact real people? But for people who work in tech, obviously they think about it technically, and it's like, I have no idea. Like I wish I had studied coding. I would have been in a much better place right now.
That's exactly what it is. It's that a lot of the people that are making these algorithms have no idea what your experience is, or they don't have friends who have experiences like this. And so a lot of the time it's just like cis straight white men that are making this, and like, oh, well, my mom has raised me to think that sex work is bad, that all of these whatever else is bad, and they're bad. So we're just going to put this into this code. There's no one else on this team who has had an experience that was different than mine. No one is going to object to what I'm writing into this. We all have buy-in. Everyone's agreed. This is what we're going to put in. This is bad. This is it done.
Years ago, I used to work and I was in the security portion. And one of the things that we used to do is, me and this other guy, we wrote this thing to look at all the traffic that was going through. And we made target words that would catch people going to these specific sites. Okay, so these words were words that maybe people from our team gave us, so that we put it into this database, so that when it comes up on the URL, we would take that information. After that, it would give the top 25, or depending on what the search that we did, and then it gives you a list of people and where they went. My job every morning from 9 o'clock to 11 o'clock was to go through those sites and see if they were really bad sites or not, and then give that top 10 list to HR. They had to move my office from being out in the open to sitting into the back of the office in a little cubicle looking at these porn sites for 2 hours a day.
You got paid money to look at porn for 2 hours a day?
Yeah, it became
fucking
sick.
amazing.
It became sick. If you do that every day, you're gonna be kind of sick of it after a while.
That would explain a lot about you, Mike.
But
what does that explain? Yeah. Actually, never mind.
But those I didn't hear you. I'm gonna look back on the recording. But what was deemed sexual, or what was deemed that had to be in the bucket so that would be caught, wasn't a big consensus of everybody. And I don't think our experience of doing it is much different than what they're doing. Right? A lot of the things that you were talking about, the legislations that were being made, it sounds like it's made by people that don't know about the trade, right? Or even people that are making these security rules, they don't know about the trade either, right?
And we covered this in previous episodes too, about legislators. They don't understand technology. They don't get it at all, and they're the ones making the rules.
It's very, very backwards. And again, this is part of the problem where I don't actually think tech has the answer to these things. I don't think legislation has the answer to these things either, because they treat it from either the criminal perspective or the technical perspective. If you just get humans to moderate all this content, you will start breeding like insane amounts of people who need a lot of very expensive therapy after they've been looking at just all kinds of content all day long. It's not realistic to get platforms to have human moderators. The turnover rate is incredibly high, and the pay is not enough. Like they for all the millions of dollars they're worth, it's actually not financially feasible to do that. So that's why people are like, okay, we need to make enough algorithms and we need to make AI better for this. But I'm like, yeah, but you're making AI that is just
biased,
racist and sexist and lots of other isms. Like it's not, you're not doing your job. And then legislators, again, they don't know what the fuck they're doing either. And they're just playing whack-a-mole at this point. Like they are not even scraping the surface for how much nefarious content that is actually criminal is going on. The agreement between a lot of tech professionals who work in content moderation, especially around trafficking and child abuse, kind of agree that the current only preventative measure that actually works is to have a really robust sexual education and consent curriculum. Like you have to teach kids from the youngest age possible about their own bodies and about consent and what is okay and what isn't. And that and also foster an environment where if something does happen that they feel comfortable enough to tell somebody about it. Because currently it's just all hush hush. And then that's where like the cycle just continues. So it's a lot. Oh my God.
Oh,
yeah.
Sam, how does human trafficking and exploitation kind of fit into all this with these social platforms?
So my research took me down a rabbit hole, and my rabbit hole told me that the passing of, for example, FOSTA SESTA, which is passed, but then other legislation around, let's say, the Earn It Act and CISIA, which are all trying to attack different parts of Section 230 legal liability. FOSTA SESTA says, okay, you can have your legal protections against third-party user content, except for when it is found to have knowingly supported, facilitated, or anything to do with sex trafficking. They don't make any distinction between trafficking and consensual sex work. The actual bill, the language says consent is always irrelevant when determining if the crime of sex trafficking has occurred, which is mind-blowing to me because consent is the only thing that is relevant in that conversation. It's shocking. And so, like, I mean, this passed in 2018, and we have stats from the past couple of years of how actually it's not helped trafficking at all. It's just made consensual sex work a lot less safe because it's pushed visibility down. You've taken away people's ability to advocate for themselves online, and so they're pushed out into the streets. You've taken down sites where maybe sex trafficking wasn't actually happening, or even prostitution. It was just one of the biggest sites was someone who made a site to basically have a bad date list for sex workers. So people would just post on the forum, be like, hey, don't go out with this guy, here's his number, here's his picture, he's abusive, he won't pay, blah, 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 blah. That's a safety measure people take. Or like, for example, like I can't use Instagram now to, let's say, text Roz and be like, hey, I have a client in 2 hours time. If I don't text you back, you need to conduct a welfare check because something's happened to me. That is technically you supporting and facilitating sex trafficking now. So it's not necessarily you who's liable. It's Facebook Messenger if we decide to do it on there. Facebook's not liable, so they won't let that happen.
Holy, I had no idea. That's crazy. And like that's just common sense. Like tell someone where you're going so that you could be safe. Like why wouldn't you want to help that?
Exactly. These are basic safety measures, but it's under the guise of stopping sex trafficking. Like that's what FOSTA stands for, the fight against like sex trafficking act. Like that's what that stands for. The Earn It Act also says basically they're attacking encryption because they think that tons and tons of child sex abuse is happening on encrypted messages. They're not wrong, but they're wrong in the sense you can tell people who don't work in tech are making these laws because I'm like, you can't outlaw an algorithm. You don't think people who are actually criminals aren't using a third-party service to encrypt their shit anyway? Making Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp and Signal give you a back door into encrypted messages for law enforcement does not stop the crime from happening. And so it made me go to this giant rabbit hole going, okay, what actually causes trafficking and what causes like child sex abuse, which are like heavy topics. I shouldn't have to be the one to research these things. I'm not a professional. I just want to show my butt on the internet. Why do I have to do this? but now I have to. And
Yeah.
like those two pillars, again, sex trafficking and trafficking, people aren't actually really sex trafficked. Like the idea that like this Liam Neeson and Taken version of like people kidnapping like little girls, little white girls off like the suburbs to sell on Wayfair is that's not, there's no evidence. No, seriously, there's no evidence that that has ever actually happened. It's like this crazy stranger danger moral panic that we have, and people like lose their rational thinking minds. Like with what happened in Wayfair, I find that so interesting. During, again, people were in the lockdown, it was pandemic, so people
Conspiracy
were kind of crazy.
theories, yeah.
But I'm like, just think about it for a second. Why would someone go through the trouble of kidnapping a child, then keeping them alive, then selling them in a box of furniture to somebody on a website? That's not how trafficking happens. And what most trafficking looks like, not sex trafficking, but human trafficking looks like, is Black and brown people who don't really speak that much English being smuggled across borders because they're trying to find a better life, and then forced to work on farms or for like long haul trucking industries. Or, for example, a big one in London that I've noticed is a lot of Vietnamese and Southeast Asian people are trafficked in of their own accord. They're not being like kidnapped and taken away. Like nobody like is like, nobody is like beaten down and like put into a like coma in Cambodia and then waking up in Denver. Like that's not how
they don't put them in burlap sack bags and seal them up and send people over.
Are they being put into like horrible conditions, like packed onto a truck or packed onto a boat and trying to like go across? Yes, of course that happens, but they're doing it because their conditions in their home countries are so much worse. And then they're forced to work in places like, for example, this is a real situation in nail salons in South London. I've had my nails done before. I will never do it again there, where I've had my nails done for £10. That's the equivalent of 20 Canadian dollars. It still takes 2 hours. It's in a tiny little shitbox where I sat there and I thought and did the math of how long it takes to get my nails done and how much I'm paying for it. And I'm like, how is this paying for anything? And then you look a little deeper and you realize these people are having their passports being held at being held hostage. Their migrant status isn't like clear. They don't really speak any English. A lot of these people, especially the women in those situations, while you're already being trafficked, you engage in sex work to survive, because that's the only way you can top up the money, because there's no way doing nails for 2 hours at a time being paid £10 is paying for anything. They're usually paying off a debt at that point. Wow. This is how most trafficking happens, right?
Ruby's on a jump in.
I wanted your thoughts on, like, and I'm going to just speak from a like Indian perspective, is in a lot of rural towns and places, people actually sell their daughters. They sell their daughters, and those daughters go into the sex trade and into trafficking. So it's just interesting to get your perspective on that, because I didn't think about it from the way you said it. Like they're just, being mobilized or moved around to other locations for other kind of work, and then end up getting into sex work.
I personally, I like to go by the rule where when it comes to specific cultural practices, as someone who is not from that culture, I don't attempt to go into that space and try to tell them how to live their lives. But the problem with actually selling your daughters specifically for sex trafficking, which does happen in South Asia, that is all an outgrowth of vulnerability. You don't think that if these families did not have other options that they wouldn't do that, or that if they weren't sort of culturally sort of conditioned into thinking that their daughters were sort of worthless. And this is like broadly speaking Asian as well, where like we worship son number one, but our daughters are worthless. That comes from like a long-standing culture of like dowries and again, deeply ingrained misogyny. But a lot of it at the end of the day is an outgrowth of vulnerability and poverty. And so like if you want to solve sex trafficking, or you happen to be a sex work abolitionist, which I think a lot of us are, even people who engage in sex work like basically would like the industry to stop being people who have to do it and more just people who actually genuinely like doing it. But if you wanted to stop that, you have to address the things that that cause vulnerability. And so you have to address homelessness, you have to address like a welfare system, you have to address like neo-capitalism at large, and whether or not why people work so much of their lives and cannot pay for things. You have to like these are all the things you have to address if you actually want to stop it. It's like a massive issue. What I would say is in regards to that, I don't think criminalizing, which probably is, I'm not sure, but this might be how people see it. I'm not sure criminalizing parents or the daughters who get into this, or even the pimps, would actually help. You would have to address the root cause of like, okay, why is this person selling their daughter? To feed themselves? They need better access to all kinds of resources. They just give them money. They need to be able to pay their rent. Like that really is the answer to the question. Kind of how when people ask me, I'm like, okay, well, is trafficking always going to happen? Then like, how do you stop trafficking? I'm like, if you want to stop trafficking, you have to get rid of international borders. And since you're not going to do that, you need to reinstate harm reductive policy and resources for these people. It has to be easier for migrants to access their rights without being deported.
Wow.
There's like a law in or like a specific visa in the US. And I think it probably, as people who work in tech, you probably see this a lot, where it's like a green card, but that green card is linked to a singular job. And so you get a lot of people who work in IT, particularly who are South Asian, who get into California, or Texas, wherever they are in their tech jobs, but they only get to keep their green card if they stay with that employer. So that employer can now they have no incentive to treat this person
exploitation. It's time. Yeah, that would be the green light for exploitation.
And so, yeah, exactly. So you have no idea when you go to that country if the job you are being told you're going to do is actually the job that you're going to do. You might just be working on a farm, even though you signed up for an IT job. You have no idea. You just go there. But now you're stuck because you're like, you can't go back to your home country. You paid so much money to be here. What do you do in this situation? To me, that's what trafficking actually looks like. That the bureaucratic state of that actual visa in and of itself, like, is supporting and proliferating trafficking. You're being like held up to like bonded labor. You have no choice. You have to stick with this employer. And if you want to change employers, no visa for you anymore. That's such a weird system to work in. And this is true of farm work. This is true of IT. This is true of beauty. A lot of restaurants and bars are huge numbers of people are trafficked in that situation. And then the other, like, again, I'm not saying that people aren't sex trafficked. People are, but like, it doesn't look like Liam Neeson in Taken. What it looks like is children, particularly queer kids. Lots of it happens within the gay community, where you run away from home because of lots of different reasons. Again, all this is outgrowth of vulnerability. Maybe you live in an abusive situation, or your parents have kicked you out. You have fucking zero self-esteem because you're 16, you're gay, and you've been spewed at with like hatred for your whole life, and you get pushed into the arms of people who might not have your best interest at heart. You might get a boyfriend or somebody who's much older. You want to like make them proud, you want to make them love you, and they start saying things like, oh, maybe we should have a threesome sometime. Maybe one day when we have this threesome, I don't participate. You have no idea if money has been exchanged in those situations. You actually don't know if you've been trafficked, but that's what a lot of it looks like.
Wow. And that seems like it's like seamless. Like you wouldn't even, if you were in that vulnerable state, you wouldn't even recognize that that's even happening. Wow. I know, Roz, you had some more questions. Why don't you jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, like, what can we do to support laws and bills being passed in order to support people that are sex workers and to make the world more safe for everyone?
I always think, again, because this is such a huge issue, like people, like it feels very overwhelming. I have like existential crises all the time about this. It starts locally, it starts at home. And so for everybody in Toronto or in Ontario, I work with an organization called Maggie's Toronto. They were started in 1986. They're basically Canada's biggest coalition of sex workers. And they engage in lots of harm reductive practices. Maybe they're not lobbying Parliament to change a law or repeal anything, but what they're trying to do is make people who are already engaging in sex work safer. So they offer things, for example, one of the most important things they offer currently is I think in order to get approved for a sex change for people who are trans, you need to have like there's a lot of paperwork you have to go through. You need to have had like references, right? And so they offer counselors who do that, who will be a reference for that, so that you can access your medical care safer. Or they offer like currently, which I think is really, really important, a Black sex worker fund, an emergency fund basically for COVID, because everybody has been out of work. And no one is more vulnerable than the Black trans community, because they already don't get hired at strip clubs. They already don't get hired at agencies. They're even more precarious. And a lot of them don't have access to like family support. And so they've been giving out grants. So things like donating to that, or just like getting involved in what they're doing, is really, really, really helpful. But it just starts with like grassroots organizations. Like it just starts locally. One of the biggest things I think that needs to change in Canada is that we use the Nordic model for our prostitution rights. So the Nordic model basically says the sex workers aren't criminalized, but the clients are. Which, in hindsight, you'd think, okay, that makes sense. That must save the girls from.
Yeah, it sounds like it would.
But it doesn't, because that means that the only clientele that we get are people who are willing to be criminals. So the people who would.
Oh, holy, yeah.
It means it means you can no longer operate in like a public way. So going to a hotel is no longer feasible. You have to go to like alleyways where you have to follow this person in their car. It means that the clientele you get are now much more dangerous. It also means that you get less clientele, you get less money. That doesn't help anybody. And so I think one of the biggest things, like one of the sort of legal battles in Canada, is to repeal the Nordic model and just set it to decriminalization. God knows if that'll ever happen. We'll see. It's very hard. Once you instate policy, it is very hard to get rid of it.
I have one more. Sorry.
Okay. Uncle might jump in there.
One more question. Explain to me about circus work.
Oh, right.
You said you're a circus worker.
So I've always been active. Jordan knows this as well, because I'm always hanging around the hoops and the bars in boxing. We have ropes as well. So yeah. I've been training lots of sort of aerial skills for a while, just because I like it. I have a dance background as well.
Sam's built, by the way. She's completely built. Like if you see her, she's like a little like gymnast. Like she's D's.
I don't have obviously access to those things right now, so I've been training contortion. When I graduated uni, like literally the week I handed my dissertation in, I saw an advertisement for casting in nightclubs in London, and the nightclubs in London are pretty different from Toronto. Like you can go to a nightclub in London and see circus acts, because that's what they have to do to keep people sat at a booth drinking all night. Like I have to be like a dance for me monkey. Like I have to do that. So I went to an audition. They took me immediately, and that's it. Like I graduated uni and immediately I literally ran away with the circus. So I work for a nightclub in London that provides circus work. So for 2 years, 2 like blissful years of my life, along with doing sort of like agency stripping. So I stopped working for clubs. I just would strip for like bachelor parties or like birthdays, or my favorite story is I stripped for a baby shower.
What? What? Why would you do a stripper at a baby shower?
I'm telling you, men are like, I talk a lot about fuck men, I hate men, but I don't really hate men, because men are fucking funny, right? They will take any excuse to have a baby shower. Their birthday, Jesus's birthday, Jesus's death. They don't give a shit. Any opportunity to have a stripper. So we got hired, me and a couple girls got hired to basically do a gig for like some fairly like well-off expats. So they had like a swanky hotel booked. They all did architecture in like Hong Kong and a couple other places. And one of their buddies was about to have a baby. And so they're like, hey, this poker night could use some strippers. So we show up with some diapers and a binky, and we like forced the to-be dad to like wear a binky and like crawl around in a diaper all day. It was really funny. And I just sat there going like, oh my God, I'm stripping for a baby shower right now. This is hilarious. Like, why would you need a stripper at a baby shower? They're so funny. But I just loved them. They were quite funny. It was great. But so like along with doing that, I started working and performing burlesque and performing for fetish parties and just doing things like basically hanging around, flying around on a hoop or like a trapeze or a pole. And it was 2 blissful years until the pandemic hit, and it was great. And that was my life like 4 or 5 nights a week.
So Sam, what's your Instagram? Because like people are gonna want to see your contortionist act. I've seen some of the stuff. I've messaged you like, how the hell can you do this? Like, it's mind blowing.
I just want to be a circle. That's my life goal. My Instagram is Samantha.Sun with 2 S's, so Samantha.SSUN. And you can find all my work there, hopefully, until Instagram bans me one day. Who knows? Who knows at this point? Wow. Yeah. Immediately after this podcast, Zuckerberg's like, we've had enough of this bitch.
That's it. She said too much. Sam, I can't thank you enough for joining us today. You are the real deal. Like I said, I cherish people that are able to teach me things, that are able to, enlighten me to things. And you definitely have done that. So thank you again. I wish you all the best of luck. I hope you stay safe during the pandemic. Hopefully we'll get another chance to work out soon, because you are awesome at holding pads for my tall ass. So
you're so tall. I'm always like my hands up like this. All right, Jordan, jab, cross.
Oh man, she's amazing. She's definitely one of my favorite partners. So Sam, thank you again. I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This was so fun. I feel like I just talked the whole time and nobody ever had any input. I feel bad.
No, you didn't.
That's
you didn't.
exactly why you're here. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm so excited for this to come out. Yay.
This has been the Technically Diverse Podcast. Remember to hit subscribe on whichever app you prefer to get your podcasts. You can also connect with us on various social platforms. On Twitter, you can follow us at TechnicallyD. On Instagram, you can follow us at Technically Diverse. Or if you prefer to watch, subscribe to our YouTube channel that shares the same name, Technically Diverse. We also love getting feedback and ideas, so if there's anything you'd like to see, you can send us an email to technicallydiverse@gmail.com.